There you go. How's that for volume?
Yeah, fine.
All right.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, Paul Finch, thank you for coming. It's very good to have you here. And you are, for people who don't know who you are, who might have read your articles in the AJ, you are now the program director of World Architecture Festival.
Yeah, that's my main activity, and I have sort of subsidiary activities as editorial director of the Architects Journal and the Architectural Review.
And you used to be the head of CABE, is that correct?
Yes, I had a long period with various roles at the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, starting off as a founder commissioner in 1999. I subsequently became deputy chairman to Stuart Lipton, and I had a long period from 2005 to 2012 of chairing CABE's design review panel for the London Olympics. And I went back to CABE as chair, and following the government decision to close off the money, was involved in merging CABE with the Design Council, where it still now resides nominally.
Yeah. For people like me who don't really know what CABE did, we should say that CABE was the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment. Like when I obviously got into practice, it wasn't around anymore. It had already been changed or incorporated into the Design Council. What exactly was it that CABE did, and what was its role at the time?
It began life as a substitute for the Royal Fine Art Commission, whose own life began in the 19th century, actually advising on art and furnishings for the Palace of Westminster. After the Great Fire and the Pugin and Barry redesign. Having done that, it slightly fell into abeyance, but got revived in the 1920s. And it acted as a sort of government watchdog to review really significant designs that were considered to be nationally important, architectural designs. And it also produced publications on things like street design, town planning, so on and so forth. It was thought by New Labour to have run out of steam, and it probably didn't help that it was chaired by a Tory politician, Lord St John of Fawsley, who at one time had been parliamentary private secretary to Margaret Thatcher. And he was perceived as being rather patrician, and it really didn't fit the kind of New Labour view of the world. So they decided to abolish the commission and to create a replacement organisation which would be more, shall we say, more democratic, more regional, more communicative, more user-friendly.
And presumably cheaper as well, because it was austerity.
No, I don't think it was cheaper, actually, because if anything, it was probably a bit more expensive because it was taken seriously. I mean, I think Blair was convinced that if you wanted a renewal program of schools and hospitals and housing and all the rest of it, that actually having a watchdog that will both promote good quality design and act as a kind of arbiter of taste is the wrong word, but an arbiter of whether things were any good or not, was considered important. So actually I don't think it was cost cutting, and we started off relatively modest, but we did grow and expand, particularly because John Prescott, when he was Deputy Prime Minister, regarded CABE as a good thing. And he doubled us in size with a budget to match because he wanted us to kind of take over public space policy, not just architecture and buildings. So our remit expanded. Fundamentally, the remit was to promote good design, and in that it represented continuity with the Royal Fine Art Commission. the most newsworthy things we did were always design review, because the magazines loved CABE slams this, CABE praises that. But actually that was only part of the story, and one of the significant areas of difference between CABE and the old RFAC was we had an enabling program, so we were offering sort of disinterested advice to clients, both professional but more likely amateur or occasional clients, not just about how to go about procuring designers, but also how to write briefs, how to run programs. We had a publications operation which reflected the programs we were doing on the ground. So, you know, how to be a good client, what constitutes good urban design, the design of new communities. And these documents are still, they're archived, they're all publicly available, and they've been widely used around the world, actually.
Okay.
So, you know, we had quite a rich program. We did education. As mentioned, we did a public space program where we were promoting things like parks and gardens. And we had a kind of proselytizing role. Our first chairman, Sir Stuart Lipson, used the phrase injecting architecture into the bloodstream of the nation. And to an extent, I think we did do that, because even though CABE no longer exists in its old guise, things like design review were widely taken up by many different organisations, and it was all done on the CABE model, which in turn derived to a great extent from the principles and practice of the Royal Fine Art Commission. I think it was more user-friendly. It was a little bit less like a magistrate's court. We would always, for example, have conversations with applicants and their architects in the room at the time of the presentation. So people who had comments to make, you would make the comment or ask a question, and you would get a response in the room, and that formed part of the conversation. The old RFAC would ask questions, and then they wouldn't give any indication of the letter that they would be writing as a result of the presentation. So people didn't know what was coming their way. In our case, we pretty much told them what they could expect. So it's kind of more interactive. I suppose you might say it was a bit more sort of Blairite in the sense of being very communicative. And I think it did a useful job, and for the money it cost the taxpayer, and it's kind of peanut money, a couple of million a year.
It was the big public projects that you focused on, wasn't it? The sort of the larger, more prominent projects. Like, was there a formula for what got referred to you and what was dealt with at a local level?
Well, in a way, we had a free hand. We could intervene, if that's the right word, in any project, public or private. Either where we were asked for an opinion about something, or where we thought, actually, this is a significant project in a significant area and it should be reviewed. Generally, somebody would want a review. So it might be a local authority if it wanted a backup to its own views that a scheme was either horrendous or wonderful. But we also did, for a period, actually tiny projects. We would review proposals for one-off houses, for example, in the countryside. Okay. So we worked at every sort of scale and in every sort of region. The dilemma for us was that, at best we were scratching the surface. If we were doing 1% of significant applications, that could be surprising. But on the other hand, if you made a difference to a couple of hundred schemes a year over a decade, that starts to be quite significant if they're the projects that are going to have a significant effect on a locality and its community. I wish CABE still exists. I think it was foolish. I mean, it was cost-cutting foolishness to get rid of it. I don't think it was malice. It was more like an accidental kind of car crash. But in any event, some of the spirit of CABE lives on. And wherever I go in the world, I find architects who still use CABE's documents, because, of course, there are certain rules or habits in respect of good architecture and urban design, which I think don't actually change very much.
Mm. And it was meant to be incorporated into the design council, wasn't it? Like, to what extent did that actually happen? Does the function that it performed still exist, just within a different organisation?
Yes, it does, but it continued, but was sort of changed utterly, because the design council is a charity which has to be self-supporting. It has to earn its own money. So CABE moved from being a publicly funded organisation, which would review things free of charge to anyone, to an operation which needed somebody to be paying it. Now, there have been examples, Oxford City Council, for example, gave Design Council CABE a contract for several years to do design review, to advise on education and training for councillors and all that sort of thing. So certain of CABE's functions do continue, but it's not systematic.
Mm.
And critically, it's not something where CABE can, as we used to, if there was a problem somewhere, or an opportunity that wasn't being properly seized, that we could make an intervention.
Yeah.
That's no longer the case. It's entirely dependent on somebody wishing to pay for the service.
All right. So the design council, or the function within the design council, can't sort of, by its own merit or its own initiative, look at a scheme and say, we think this should be called in.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And of course the sort of quasi statutory powers that CABE had, which actually were no more than the Royal Fine Art Commission. It was a bit smoke and mirrors. We could ask to see any designs made in respect of a planning application that was extant. There was government guidance saying what sort of projects should be referred to CABE, nationally significant, above a certain size, and so on and so forth. But actually, there were no real power. It was responsibility without power. CABE didn't have the power to stop any proposal, nor indeed to approve any proposal. What it could do, and what it did do, was to offer disinterested advice to the planning authority, the architects, and the client as to what the merits or demerits of a particular scheme were, in the view of the Commission and its design review panel.
Mm. And did it work in coordination with local design review panels, or did those not exist at the time?
There were some, I would say, regional rather than local, or they would be based on one of the big cities. And yes, there was a network of regional design review panels which CABE helped to coordinate, and indeed acted as a conduit for funding. So we could call people all over the country if we wanted specific local input on a project, and people from those regional panels would come down for sort of one-off design reviews of things that were affecting them in their area. And CABE actually ran a regional programme. I chaired the regional committee of CABE for some while, where we would visit and go around the country looking at particular places with either particular problems or opportunities, and give as helpful advice as we could.
Because one of the things I'm thinking a lot more about, especially with this Building Beautiful Commission, is what is the appropriate role of the government with regards to built environment policy, and to what extent should the government or local government intervene or dictate what is built or what it looks like?
Well, I mean, it's a kind of eternal question, isn't it? Should communities dictate what things look like? What's a community? Is it self-selecting? What powers might it have, and why should it have those powers? And the essential structure that we have is one of responsibility for making decisions resides with people who've been elected. I think in the end, that's about as good as you're going to get. Having done that, you then have your checks and balances to try to prevent the dictatorship of the elected, And that's why there's this constant, you could call it tension or creative tension, balance or imbalance. I mean, I think it's all of those things on different occasions, between, as it were, the voice of the people, the local authority, the technical advice offered by planners. There is a system of law in place which allows you to make a plan. It's the only reason that the system can run is it's in law. It's not arbitrary, and of course local opinion has very definitely got its place in all that, and there are arrangements for consultation. You can't just approve things just like that without letting people know what's going on, so on and so forth. Now, having said that, there's still an element of dirigisme in it. I mean, the local planners might say it's a terrible scheme, so it gets thrown out by elected members. But then there's an appeal, and ultimately it'll be the Secretary of State who decides on the basis of his inspector's advice, and of course having taken legal counsel and on the advice of officials. But ultimately the power travels up rather than down in most instances. Is that a good thing? On balance, I think it's probably better, because actually when that power goes upwards, there are a lot of responsibilities and kind of baggage attached to it. I mean, it's not exactly Napoleonic. The Secretary of State's decision can itself, of course, be challenged by judicial review, and has been, if he does something which isn't properly explained. On the other hand, what it does stop is kind of local Soviets deciding that because some bloke's never heard of render, he thinks it's a suspicious continental material and doesn't want any of it to appear on any building on his patch, which has happened. So I think what it does do, it stops a sort of nonsense happening at a local level of entirely arbitrary, possibly ignorant, though not necessarily, but possibly whimsical or neophobe or neophile, neophiliac attitudes, determining what it is that people can do with their own land and their own money when they want to build something.
Yeah. Well, there's a sort of weird tension between the sort of the laissez-faire side of the spectrum, where it sort of argues that everyone should just be able to build whatever they want and it doesn't really matter, and the more sort of state-dictated angle of, it's perfectly reasonable for the state or local government to say you can design this, or you should design this way, or use this design guide, etc., etc.
Well, it's pretty. I mean, it's still pretty laissez-faire. I mean, in law, you can build anything you want on land that you control, unless somebody can produce convincing and sound reasons about why you shouldn't. It is actually in law that way round. Of course, the way it's viewed, and certainly the way to an extent bureaucracies view it, is that you can't do anything without their say-so. But actually, I think it's quite an important distinction. Yes, you do have to get planning permission to build anything of any significance, but you certainly don't have to get planning permission to do quite a lot of building, actually. If you look at things you don't need permission for, it's quite substantial at a kind of local level. Actually, if you're doing something significant which is going to have, therefore, significant impact on other people, then isn't it appropriate that you should be going to get some sort of permissions? And this, of course, there is the question of building regulation as well. So, building I don't think anyone's going to say, well, you should be able to build anything you want, and who cares about fire regulations? They're just an imposition.
Yeah.
And you could argue that planning in that sense is no different to fire regulation. It's necessary and it's desirable, provided that it is administered in a fair and reasonable fashion.
Well, it's sort of, there's a key distinction in regulations to do with performance and ones to do with aesthetics, aren't there? Because like you'd say, there's loads of regulations, say on, I don't know, vacuum cleaners that say it must do this, must do that, but there's nothing that says your vacuum cleaner must look like this.
Well, there's nothing in planning that says your building has got to look like this or like that. In fact, they're explicit in the National Planning Policy Framework. There are explicit injunctions against that. And this business of aesthetic control, I think, is grossly exaggerated. You know, the idea that the state is attempting to tell people to design things in a certain manner. And what I say to them, where is that where is it? The only place where it applies is, of course, in Britain, you know, country where heritage, for better or worse, has a profound place in our psyche. So where you get told what you can and you can't do in no uncertain terms, it's in relation to heritage. It's not in relation to new build at all. You can do anything you want. And I would say that actually all you have to do is to look around to see the point of that. You know, no one said you can't build the Gherkin, even though the Dean and Chapter of St Paul's objected to a circular form at the top because they said it was a sacred form, like their dome. And therefore was an inappropriate building because you could see it from St Paul's. But it got built. Yeah. And in fact, you know, Zaha Hadid built things. You know, where is this thing about planning law tells you what things have got to look like? I think it's a fantasy. It's not true.
Yeah. What about things like local design guides? So if you're the I don't know, the local authority for the Cotswolds, and it says in your design guide that all the new developments must use Cotswold stone, say, and there are sort of hyper-local guidelines that the local authorities say you don't have to use these, but they're guidelines, and if you don't use them, you're not likely to get permission.
Well,
does that count?
It's because of the obsession with heritage, and this all goes back to the Essex Design Guide from the 1970s, where they invented entirely bogus, unhistorical propositions about materials and form. I mean, they're ridiculous. And actually, you can, generally speaking, especially if the building is invisible from any public place, you can, of course, apply to build any sort of house in any style you want. And, you know, this is under various bits of planning legislation. They're always changing the number and the letter on the clause. But, you know, let's say it's the get out clause where actually, you know, Rowan Atkinson wants a Richard Meyer modernist house in Oxfordshire or in the Cotswolds, wherever it is, and he gets it. So, you know, who cares about all the other stuff around there? And actually, what business is it of anyone else's anyway? Yeah. And the same thing applies to, I would say, all architectural styles. I mean, if somebody wants to build a classical house on a country estate, our attitude at CABE was that actually, why should anybody stop that happening? So I think the laissez-faire argument is a good one, and I think that you know, it's the Heritage Brigade, and I mean all of the Heritage Brigade, not just the people who want everything to be classical, think nothing's improved since the 18th century, but also the people who think that nothing from the 20th century should ever be knocked down. And it's a kind of at worst, I think, is a sort of sick obsession with the past and a profound belief that all the talented designers we've got today can't do anything better or the equivalent of what their talented predecessors did in centuries gone by. And I would say that's demonstrably not the case, and people should get a life.
So do you think in the case of like a local development, say a small housing development within a small settlement, do you think that the residents of that settlement should have a say in, or rather, by what mechanism should the residents have a say in what that looks like? If at all?
You mean the existing residents?
Yeah, the existing residents. Yeah, or the people who are going to see it that aren't the ones who are going to buy it or going to.
Well, the first thing, you know, I would just point out that there is a very serious irony failure on the part of people who live in homes which were themselves new once, objecting to something else which is going to be new now. I mean, it's a form of sickness, and it leads to sort of mental gymnastics which justify in an entirely selfish and self-interested and self-obsessed way that I'm here and I'm more important than somebody who's going to live here in the future. It's a ridiculous attitude, especially given that we all die. I mean, it's a kind of psychological condition that I find rather hard to understand. And it's generally based on extreme selfishness, and partly explains why attitudes to development, particularly in the countryside, have resulted in rural communities being completely unable to house themselves and their offspring because of some nutcase planning rule that says it's sort of wrong to build a house in a field.
Yeah. But
Why is it wrong?
Yeah. Well, it's it's unsurprising as far as I'm concerned that people sort of act on their own with their own regard when it comes to this sort of thing, and the sort of the hypocrisy, I guess, is an inevitable human trait as far as I can see, even though it's not a good one, certainly. But do you think the current system of objections, which are then taken into account by planners when they're awarding applications, do you think that's an appropriate one, or does that need to change in terms of the engagement with the existing populace around a new development?
Well, I think, protest is inevitable, and I don't mind people expressing their view at all. I think if they object to something, they've every right to do so. On the other hand, I don't think you should base a planning system around objections. I think you should base a planning system around what is reasonable in the circumstances. Is it reasonable to build housing in this area? And the answer to that is almost inevitably yes, if you've got a growing population. I mean, why wouldn't you? And why would you want to freeze something? So, we're going to privilege the people who live here now just because through an accident of history they happen to occupy homes, which, I mean, I repeat the phrase, we used to use this at CABE a lot. Everything was new once. So don't imagine that somehow you're there as sort of God-given right. You know, if you lived in a cave, that might be true, but if you're living in built form, it's not. And I think the planning system is actually rather good at balancing out arguments for and against development. In a way, that's what it's there for. And the alternative, a lot of people complain about planning, say, oh, it doesn't reflect local opinion and all the rest of it. Well, why don't you get rid of planning? And then guess what? People who owned land would just build exactly what they wanted. See if you like that. So I think it's a sort of slightly false argument. And there are so many checks and balances in the system as a whole. So objectors have their right to say things, house builders do, the architects do, and everybody else does. And in the end, actually, I would say most things of merit tend to get built, actually. Now, it's true that there are things of very little merit that also get built. That's in a way another question, because quite often those things are in situations where there is no existing community to moan about it. And that's where you need your professional opinion, and possibly bodies like CABE or design review panels to say, well, hang on a moment, just because there's nobody living next door doesn't make this a good project. It may be a very badly designed project, and if it's very badly designed, then it's not going to be great for the people who are going to be living here, for the next 100 years. So, it's not a question of saying that everything's perfect about planning, but I kind of object to the notion that everything about the planning system and planners is all wrong and useless. The vast majority of planning applications go through the system in the appropriate times, 8 weeks. And it's only the big tough stuff that takes a long time. And quite often that's because somebody is having a punt. They're not doing conforming applications which fit in with a local plan. They're having a punt. So it's a gamble. And even then, what the British system does, because it's not a zoning system like, New York.
Yeah.
It's the Nigel Hugill's got a lovely phrase to describe this. The developer was Stuart Lipton, who did Stratford. It's 3 million square feet, was the basis for our London Olympic bid in the end. And it was terrifically resilient, and it's kind of all working out. They never had a public inquiry. Nigel's point is the British planning system is the occasion for a conversation. I quite like the fact conversation is an anagram of conservation. And I think actually balancing out new and existing is part of what good design is all about.
Yeah, I mean, from the sort of point of view of the system of objections that you have, it's a negative feedback system, really, isn't it? That you object if you don't like it, but there's very little sort of proactive encouragement. Is there a way, do you think, to turn that around and make it a more positive and proactive system where people are consulted before something is proposed in some way or another?
Well, people are always consulted before, before they're built, let's say. Now, before they're proposed is such a theoretical matter. And actually, you're only going to get people to go to a public meeting when they're going to oppose something, right? Nobody goes to a public meeting to support something. They might, if, let's say, there's a possibility of getting a bypass, that's going to reduce traffic, it's good for kids. They'll probably only go to the public meeting if somebody's trying to stop it. If it's being proposed and they like it, why do they have to go to a meeting?
Yeah.
So essentially, this is a reactive process, and the proof positive that that's the case is that in theory, the entire public has got the chance to determine what their area will be like in the future by going to consultation meetings about the local plan. Well, how many people go? The only people go actually are kind of landowners and developers, maybe some architects, the kind of the good guys who just want to promote good standards in their area. The general public, that's quite a tough one. The nearest you get to it is amenity societies. And most amenity societies basically are frightened. And I completely understand that, because in many cases they've got something to be frightened about, which is things are going to change. The smart ones kind of embrace it and say, well, we know change is coming, but we want it to be good change. And the bad ones, or not bad ones, but your average amenity society, they basically just want to stop things being knocked down because they like where they live. And let's face it, we're all NIMBYs. Architects, politicians. If we have half a chance and we could say, I don't want construction right next door to me, you know what? Everyone's going to vote for that. And it's just, that is human nature. And I think we have to understand that. But we also have to understand that the planning system isn't and shouldn't be designed to pander to NIMBYs, nor should it pander to sort of venal developers trying to do bad projects.
Well, I think there's a lot of skepticism about public consultations at the moment, because it is, like you say, the very few interested parties or the busybodies who have nothing else better to do who go along and protest or contribute, whereas the vast majority of people who have jobs and day-to-day lives and are slightly more apathetic to it aren't consulted or don't engage with it. So is there a way of sort of getting round that by linking consultations to local democracy in some way, or by having, I'd say, ward councillors make the final decision about applications, or having someone who's actively incentivized to engage with everyone having some say in the process, and thereby having a feedback system that way?
Well, I think the idea of giving more power to ward councillors is akin to giving more power to the church warden in Dad's Army. It's absolutely amazing how people can turn into little tyrants given half a chance. And I think that's the last thing you want, frankly. Also, the more you devolve power down to those individuals, frankly, the more improper and undue influence is going to be exercised, etc., etc., etc. I think this stuff needs to be transparent, and the way of doing that is to have officers' reports that are open to public inspection, planning committee meetings. I'm not wild about planning subcommittee meetings that are passing things on the nod, unless there's proper scrutiny. I think as a system has got a lot going for it. And actually, in a way, the reason that people don't want to get massively engaged with their local plan is, I think, at a certain level, people do understand that change is inevitable. And if you've got a successful community in a successful town, it is going to grow. And actually, the reason they're not too fussed about it, unless it's going to happen right next door to them, in which case they join, that worst of all democratic organisations, the single issue pressure group. What a pain in the neck they are. I mean, they're kind of, that's what the worst of heritage groups are, or amenity societies. They're just single issue pressure groups. They do not want to and will not look at the big picture. They don't care about anyone except themselves and their single issue that they're obsessed with. And they don't care about the consequences. I'll give as an example, which most people have forgotten. We had an extant planning permission to build an estuary airport in the early 1970s, and it was scrapped because of single issue pressure groups complaining about this and that and this and that. From that point of view, it explains why France managed to build a couple of airports while we were still messing about deciding on a new terminal at Heathrow, and why China's opening an airport a month and we can't even decide, should we have a new runway at Gatwick? It's pathetic. Yeah. It's pathetic.
Well, I suppose that's the downside of a system where you do have proper engagement with people rather than an authoritarian approach of, we're just going to build it and we don't care what you think.
Yeah, but it always happens in the end, doesn't it? That's the joke. That's why it's a phony. Because if in the national interest you need to expand an airport, actually, it doesn't matter what the consultation is. It's just a way of converting public money into the houses that planning lawyers buy at the end of any long inquiry. It's great for them. Everybody feels fed up because actually, if you were consulted and it didn't go your way, then you say, well, consultation doesn't work, which actually philosophically, of course, is nonsense. And occasionally, when it does go your way, what happens is a generation later, we're kind of wondering why didn't we get that estuary airport? Why couldn't we be like Hong Kong or Beijing or Tokyo, or Paris, or Amsterdam, or anywhere else you want to mention? Why can't we do things here?
So you think it would be better to take for the government to take a more strategic approach and increase the number of projects that it builds on a non-consulted basis, effectively, or to speed up the process at the price of sort of rigorous consultation for the national good and the sake of the speed of progress?
Yeah, well, I think major infrastructure projects, in the end, the decisions about them always get taken at a national level, but the consultation takes place about the detail. I mean, you make a strategic decision to build a motorway, but the precise route, I think, is a matter for negotiation and consultation. I mean, why destroy things if you can avoid it?
Yeah.
And okay, it costs another 50 million, but you just save 3 villages or something like that. We're having this argument now about HS2, and in typical British fashion, what we often do is somehow to get the worst of all possible worlds. In other words, we have consultation procedures, but then having actually run them through, and if it's in the national interest, then why would the fat of villages going to be destroyed get in the way of what is in the national interest? So then we're really miserly about the compensation payments. Why don't we cut to the chase and just give anyone who's going to be affected twice what their property is worth and get on with it? Because actually, you speed it up, you save a fortune.
And people would complain a lot less if they were getting twice market value for their properties.
They certainly would. And actually, I don't think it's unreasonable, because it's not just the value of the property, it's the disruption to their lives.
And the inconvenience of having to move, isn't it?
Exactly. And it's a kind of, I think it's an appalling attitude that we have, that it's a kind of cavalier disregard for people's personal feelings, who are not in a position to stop something happening. I would still give the example of the estuary airport as the disastrous example of when you allow these people actually to stop something. Ally that to kind of political cowardice on Harold Wilson's part. And I think all this big stuff, if you're going to take strategic decisions, for God's sake, take them. Be generous to the people who are going to be affected and get on with it.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a strong argument for taking a more rigorous and slightly less bureaucratic approach for large national infrastructure projects. It does seem harder at a smaller local level, though, to do with how you actually consult people and how people feel consulted, because you can't take a sort of local authoritarian approach to a one or two house size housing development.
Well, I think that housing estates are just sort of notorious red rags to a bull, aren't they? Probably worse than roads in a way, because a lot of people like roads. Look at the
everyone uses them, don't they?
Look at the M25. All those relatively small settlements that suddenly got a slip road onto the M25. All thought it was marvellous.
Yeah, well, I thought it was interesting watching Question Time on Thursday, where the residents of Aylesbury were complaining that they don't have a station on HS2.
Yeah,
but that if there was proposed one, they'd all suddenly probably say this is great, except for the ones whose garden it went through. So it's, obviously the merits and good sides and bad sides to that project individually, but in terms of the sort of the system more generally, do you think, and the Building Beautiful Commission, what would you like to see come out of that in sort of a year's time in terms of recommendations on any level, whether design or planning or?
Well, I think the word beautiful is a tough one, because let's say I think we could agree more easily about something that's well designed as opposed to beautiful. I'd take a kettle, because the design is going to have something to do with its utility and its function. It's not simply about aesthetics. And the word beauty, I think, is just so loaded. Building beautiful, it's illiterate, it's ungrammatically. Shouldn't it be building beautifully or beautiful building? I honestly, I'm always interested in the way that language is used on these occasions. And I think the Building Beautiful Commission, the BBC, to me has got this horrible jarring tone, and it's a really poor way to start a conversation. Building beautiful sounds like Bernard Matthews stuffing turkeys. Oh, it's beautiful. Yeah. And I think it's building beauty would have been better. At least it would have sounded like kind of recognizable English. So it's a very poor way to start. I personally think that there are the fundamental misconception in the creation of this whole thing, which has got nothing to do with the people involved, and I'm certainly not interested in ad hominem attacks on Roger Scruton or any of the people involved. I think they're pathetic. But the creation of this thing, I think, is based on an entirely fallacious premise, which is that somehow we can solve our housing crisis because those pesky planners and communities up and down the land will start giving instant permissions to the million extra homes that we need, or whatever this year's favourite figure is, because, as it were, and to exaggerate for the sake of the argument, that homes have got columns and pediments, as is complete fantasy. So the first thing I hope comes out of this campaign, and it may do, is an acknowledgement that in the eyes of at least some of the people who've set it up, that it's a false premise, that actually a housing shortage has nothing to do with ideas of beauty, and it will not be solved by imagining that by adopting one particular architectural style, which some people think is more beautiful than another architectural style, that somehow that's going to resolve anything, because I don't think it will. I think the upside might be that actually the discussion of aesthetics in architecture and what it is that we admire and like in terms of visual culture is an extremely interesting area, and I could well imagine that there could be a strand of this campaign that has a lot more to do with that, and a lot less to do with the fantasy about solving the housing problem. So those would be my sort of two hopes in a way: end the housing numbers fantasy, but by all means, let's have a debate about aesthetics, which is quite rare in British public life, and yet we actually have a highly sophisticated visual culture. It's just that in general, it's not to do with architecture.
Yeah.
It's to do with graphics, the world of advertising, film, television, animation now, which is absolutely intriguing.
Yeah.
And I don't imagine that the sort of building beauty, I can't imagine Kit Molehouse getting excited about animations, and I don't suppose he'd find them beautiful. So I think to place architecture in the wide pantheon of visual culture, I think it's interesting, and I would be extremely interested in from Roger Scruton downwards in what people have got to say about it and what they think about it.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on the point of the false premise about the housing numbers, because as you said a minute ago, that most applications go through in the appropriate time, and the assumption that if everything suddenly is, even if it's better quality generally, ignoring the style question, that it's suddenly going to sail through quicker, is a false premise. And on the numbers, I mean, a good point you made at one of the events the other day was that it's about a local authority house building numbers have crashed since the 80s, and you only have to look at the graph to see how sort of the distribution of house building was a certain way, and local authority house building was pretty high, and then suddenly went down in the 80s to almost zero, and that's effectively making up what is not making up for the shortfall.
Exactly so. And I think it's I don't think there's anything mysterious as to why we've got a housing shortage, and politicians of course like to pretend that it's the planning system, that it's building regulation, this and it's that, and I think it's a lot more simple than that. We gave up public building at precisely the moment when, for various reasons, the population was increasing, inward migration, kind of movement from north to south, and so on and so forth. And actually, it's a very good example of what happens if you abandon planning. So basically, we knew this was happening, we didn't plan for it, and guess what? Now we're in a mess. It has absolutely nothing to do with aesthetics. And I find it embarrassing that politicians are always casting round for someone else to blame, except themselves. It's the political class, Tories and Labour alike, who bought into this idea that we could do without a public sector programme. They all think generation rent's marvellous. So all these I mean, it's Labour as well as Tory rentiers with their 6 homes. They think buy-to-let is so clever. And if you ask them, well, do you own your own home? The answer is always yes. And we know why that is, because you pay a mortgage off after 30 years and you've got a real asset to look after you in your dementia years. But they think it's really smart for a new generation to pay rent for 30 years and end up with no asset whatsoever, just at the point when you're retiring. You know, these people are sick hypocrites.
Yeah. Well, I think the housing problem is such an interesting one because it's so sort of multifaceted and there's so many different variables, and it varies so much by location as well, that it is effectively a London and southeast problem more so, and not a everywhere else problem. And everyone seems to have their own opinion as to what is the major contributing factor, and there's sort of 100 different things that affect it, and no one can actually even agree that there's lots of different things that are the issue.
Well, the politicians can't because they don't want to acknowledge their responsibility for this matter. And the point is, you've got a rising population. I mean, London is the extreme example, but it's not the only example by any manner of means. And actually, you know, rural populations collapse because you're not allowed to build homes there. But basically, we haven't built enough. I mean, you know, as you say, look at the graphs. We didn't build enough, but we knew that the populations were increasing. Now, the people who there are planners who actually do plan on the basis of real world. I give one example. The strategy planners at London Underground, because they have to think in kind of 20 years, how many people are going to get on the tube in 20 or 25 years' time. The national census is of obsessive interest for them. And the London Underground strategy planners, by looking at the census, I think around about 1990, were the first people to spot that London had stopped depopulating after 50 years, and that central London in particular was repopulating big time. Now, this, of course, helped them in their arguments to get the Jubilee line built, and then Crossrail, and, fingers crossed, Crossrail 2, because this, despite the problems of Crossrail 1, from a strategic point of view, absolutely critical to the future of London and chunks of the southeast. So proper planning, it's survey, diagnosis, prognosis. If that attitude had applied to the housing market, then we would have had a lot more housing, provided we'd had the housing equivalent of London Underground. But of course we didn't. So the question for me is, well, who is it politically who's going to say, actually, we do need that equivalent? We need a pretty de-registe, public sector procured housing programme, and who's saying it? The answer is no one.
Yeah, well, it's sort of difficult because people interpret or perceive housing as an individual kind of thing, because it's an individual properties, whereas everyone understands that train lines and motorways and things and airports are public infrastructure.
Yes, so I think this is a very good point, because actually the refusal to treat housing as infrastructure, and it did used to be treated as infrastructure, even whatever their faults, the GLC overspill estates, etc., 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 they were treating housing as infrastructure. The fact that individuals live in these homes is no different to individuals getting on a tube train. What's the difference? You have to live somewhere, and you have to travel somewhere, and you've got to work somewhere. So I think it's a good way of thinking about it. And actually, in some ways, I had a conversation with Boris Johnson, whose housing record is starting to look not so bad compared with Sadiq Khan's. And not so bad compared with Ken Livingstone's. Of course, these mayors all suffer under the delusion that the private house building sector is going to build out a social housing programme. Well, I've got news for them. No, it isn't. And in some ways, I think it shouldn't. I mean, it's just another political fantasy land idea about how the world works. But anyway, Johnson said he did think about housing as infrastructure, and that's the way we should think about it. And I agree with that. It's about numbers.
Yeah.
It's not about aesthetics, which doesn't mean that stuff can't be well designed. And you can start off with something that, to be fair to Johnson, to my mind, the first politician for 50 years who did something positive about the housing market, because he introduced London space standards, which were 20% higher than the previous compulsory space standards of Parker Morris, which were scrapped by Michael Heseltine, the great Tory free marketeer in the early 1980s, which why we ended up in London and therefore elsewhere building little hutches.
Yeah, it's sort of a difficult question. I mean, for in terms of social house building or local authority house building, I sort of see quite a strong conceptual difference or political difference between a local authority building houses which are kept as social housing and ones which are sold on to the market immediately, or even rented out at market rates. Like, how do you think the balance of those things needs to be established? Because obviously there's a lot of conservative opposition to the idea of mass social housing that's retained. But I think there'd be a lot of less opposition if it was sort of local authorities acting as developers commercially.
Yes, I think it's a very interesting question, because there's no doubt about it that in recent years, my broad brush view is that Conservatives just dislike poor people, and Labour are embarrassed by them. So neither of them do anything about their housing conditions, and that of their children. And I think what we have to do is to, as it were, reinvent the council estate for the 21st century. Because I think now, unfortunately, the idea of the council estate as being a real mixture of people in terms of income and occupation. Let's say, as a comparison, in Singapore, where 80% of housing is owned by the state and built by the state, it's only the really pretty rich who live in custom houses that they bought or have had built, and everybody else lives in state housing, and that varies in terms of its size and its rentals, and it certainly varies in terms of the nature of the people who live in it. It's a very broad brush of Singaporean community life, rather extraordinary combination of a kind of state socialist model in one of the most private sector oriented countries in the world.
When you say state housing, though, is that housing that's been built by the state but then sold onto the market, or is it housing that's still retained by the state?
It's retained. It's the Housing Development Board. And actually, in the recent debate where Labour were condemning Singapore and Tories were saying it was marvellous, it was, you know, one of those typical binary British debates: is it good or is it evil? But one thing the Labour people never got round to talking about was how come this private sector economy looks after kind of poor people in housing conditions, which Labour has failed to do since the 1980s. It's unbelievable. And I think these days, probably, if you were developing, let's call it an estate, then you'd almost flip the kind of percentages. So local authorities want private house builders to make 30 or 40% of their units affordable, whatever that means. Another abuse of language, by the way. You could conceive of a council estate where you might sell off, say, 20% of it for private purchase, and you might have another chunk of it which was let out on a private basis. Then you could have some affordable and you could have some social. I think we don't need to be hidebound by a notion of the council estate as monolith social ghetto.
Yeah, well, that's what people are scared of, isn't it? That you'll return to this 100% social rented sector where it's only people who are on benefits living in one sort of gated development almost that turns into a slum.
Exactly.
That's what people are scared of.
And I think the Conservatives are particularly averse to the notion of building ghettos for the indigent, as they would call them, or think about them, you know, on benefits, no job, etc., etc., etc. And it's not socially desirable to promote that kind of development for all sorts of reasons. But the thing is, council estates didn't used to be like that. They did have a much wider range, and you'd have to delve into a whole series of policies as to why that changed. And it's got something to do with the sort of Cathy come home syndrome, which is that the obligation on local authorities to provide housing to the biggest hard luck story, being harsh about it, almost inevitably means that your council estate becomes a desperate place of last resort. That is not the spirit with which local authority housing began. You know, look at the Arnold Lane estate, you know, near Spitalfields. Modern, progressive, mixture of people. Assumption was they'd all be working, or most of them, or retired.
Yeah.
So I think we have to kind of reinvent what the notion of public housing is. But most important is to get those numbers going. And actually, rather than thinking, oh, it's such a big task, you know, we couldn't possibly manage this, I think if you looked at what the private sector builds anyway for its own purposes, and it'll kind of do what it wants to do. You can't force the private sector to build houses. And when there's a slowdown, guess what? You're going to get a slowdown in your so-called affordable units. I think it would be more honest, actually, to say to the private sector, you know what? The affordable level on your estate should be zero, because we're going to build out public estates alongside you, in addition to what you're doing, not instead of. And actually, you know, supposing, just to pick numbers, supposing you did 1,000 units a year in a typical London borough, is 1,000 extra units, is that a lot? Really? They're all the size of towns. Of course it isn't. So all of a sudden, if you split that big problem down into a small one, it's 1,000 homes a borough on top of what the private market's doing. That's 33,000 a year. That's a third of a million over a decade. And if you think about, I think that would be a good way to start thinking about it. Break it down into smaller, imaginable chunks, and then take your 1,000 and say, well, could we find, you know, a few sites to take 100 units, and a few more to take 50, and a few more to take 3.
Yeah.
Gets you 1,000, and there's no shortage of land. A big fat lie.
Yeah. Well, I think there's, like you say, there's this sort of fear that you're going to return to this idea of ghettoized council estates. Whereas if you, like, what you really want is a completely imperceptible difference between the units that are sold on the freeholds, the units that are retained but rented on market rates, and the units that are kept on as social rent. And that would sort of add to the numbers that the private sector and housing associations are already giving, but without that sort of political difficulty of the idea of returning to ghettoized council estates.
Well, I think that's smart, and I think there are certain models. I think about the Olympic Village out at Stratford, which the skeptics all said, oh, it's all going to be sold off to absentee overseas investors. Well, it hasn't been. A big chunk of it went to a housing association, and a lot of it's is rented out by Delancey, so it's private sector landlord. And I think that is an alternative model to what you might do. You know, that housing scheme came about. Why? Because you had the Olympic Delivery Authority. It owned the land. It had a budget. It had its own planning powers. Now, it surely can't be beyond the wit of man to think, well, if you can do that on that site in Stratford, why can't you have a London-wide equivalent of the ODA? Why can't I have the London Housing Development or Delivery Authority, which actually does stuff? It doesn't talk about it, and it doesn't just funnel money or prepare sites or back some scheme that some developer's doing. You know, I think you just have to be bolder. And actually, in London's own history are the clues to how we resolve this housing crisis. We go back to doing what we did for a century.
Yeah. Well, now that the local authority borrowing cap's been removed, what's actually stopping local authorities getting on with it and borrowing and building like we're discussing?
Well, I think that there are very welcome examples of local authorities that are doing it, but of course, culturally, they haven't been doing it for decades. So that's the first problem. In other words, is it in your, to use the phrase, is it in your DNA to produce housing in quantity? The answer is no, it isn't. Second, a lot of the stuff that they're trying to do is estate renewal. In other words, rather like the Singaporeans who are now doing estate renewal after more than 50 years of independence. So all the blocks that they built up, you know, in the late 1960s all need renewing or demolishing or replacing. So here's the appropriate phrase: net additional. Now, in all the housing surveys that you see and all the claims being made, we're doing this, we're doing that, we've got more starts and all the rest of it, if net additional is not in there, then smell a rat, because you see these extravagant claims being made for schemes. You say, well, hang on a moment, what about the stuff you're knocking down? And what about housing years lost? Look at Robin Hood Gardens. Ridiculous waste of embodied energy knocking down those concrete buildings. They've got to decant those people who occupy housing that someone else could occupy. Then you've got to demolish. Then you've got years of construction and all the extra, carbon emissions associated with that. then you've got to decamp people back in again. I mean, the housing years lost never get accounted in all this, but they should do.
Yeah.
Because housing happens through time. It's not 2-dimensional, it's 4-dimensional. That's why it's so fascinating. But when I see the sort of Saville surveys, they're pretty good, they're pretty honest. I look at these housing numbers. The first, I want to knock off the stuff that's being built. Well, it's a bit slack at the moment, but certainly until quite recently, stuff being built for non-Londoners. It's a completely separate market. So why not take that out? Which at the higher end of the market, you're probably taking most of it out, actually.
Well, okay. Is it Singapore? You have to be a citizen to be able to buy property there?
Yeah, it's quite tough owning a property in Singapore, but I don't think that's another of those nostrums that politicians like to trot out, because it obscures the real reason why overseas investors like London. And the reason for that is tax-free capital gains, robust legal system. No one's going to come steal your home in the middle of the night and then cheat you in court. Those are the reasons people like it. And actually, if you look at the transactional market, the proportion of the total market that those people involved in is quite tiny. The transactional market, of course, mostly 90% existing properties and not new stuff. So that's the next thing you have to watch out for, is to keep a sense of perspective about the difference that new construction makes to the whole. And that brings us to the question of what it is that people like. Now, what it is that people like is, in general, almost any historical style except the present.
Well, is that true though? Because I think there's when you build something that's contemporary but is clearly vernacular in the sort of the Kenneth Frampton critical regionalist sense, like people seem to like that as much, if not more, than plain copying pastiche kind of stuff. So is there, again, we're sort of going back into architecture itself as a profession. By what mechanism are architects incentivized to do that sort of stuff, rather than either hyper-modern stuff which looks out of place or just pastiche copies?
Yeah, well, of course, the one has an effect on the other, doesn't it? I mean, when Prince Charles made his comments and we had a sort of brief revival of classicism, you have people basically modern office blocks and shoving a pediment on it. And, Robert Maxwell had a scheme for the Daily Mirror building, and he splattered it all over his newspaper, their new designs. And the headline said, "We think you'll like this, sir," message to Charles. Because it was, milk and water classicism, rather illiterate as I remember it. But yeah, I mean, I think actually the test about architecture and buildings, there is a sort of litmus test, isn't there, which is it any good? And of course, projects that have had intellectual energy and commitment put into them are usually quite good, and stuff that hasn't often isn't, and therefore, given a choice, my point is that actually the transactional market in many parts of Britain involves people buying between the wars Edwardian, Victorian, Georgian, and going back as far as you like, and actually that's what most people buy. Now, you could say, well, it's a style thing and it all derives from classicism, and in a way, everything does. However, I think there are more banal reasons why people like buying older stuff. First, it's lasted. There's a sort of robustness test. You're never quite sure about something brand new, are you? If you've had a Russell Hobbs kettle from the 1960s, would you want to bet on buying one today that you'll still be using in 50 years' time? I wouldn't. Second, the space and volume standards are usually far superior to anything contemporary you can get today. And that's because of this terrible dumbing down which took place, as a result of people like Heseltine. Worse and worse space standards, which is why Boris Johnson, in his first mayoral campaign, said, I'm introducing new space standards. Now, he didn't have to invent them because work on space standards had been done, funnily enough, by Richard Rogers and the Architecture Design Unit. So there was a backstory to that. But the point was, Boris made speeches saying, I'm sick of us, having the worst space standards in Europe. I'm going to do something about it. And do you know what? He did. He still didn't hit his numbers on units. But I think, credit where it's due. And that was a rare example of somebody trying to actually improve the kind of spatial and volumetric quality of what people were going to be living in. So I think, of course people like old stuff, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I live in an Edwardian terraced house. It has its disadvantages, but you do your loft conversion, you do your kitchen extension, you have modernity in the midst of a historical style, and you sort of crack on with it. I just, in a way, I don't see it as a massive issue. There are people who like to buy new, and let's say if 5% of the buying public in any given year want to buy new, that's fine, because that will keep the market going, because the percentage of new homes in any given year is sub 5%.
Yeah, there are a few markets that are more dominated than housing by second-hand goods.
Absolutely,
it's the like you say, 95% of the market is second-hand,
and it's good, because that's about reuse and recycling and renewal. And actually, I don't think there's anything unhealthy about that. So it's a very unusual market, actually, and that's another reason why I think one should try to disconnect the kind of aesthetic argument from the politics of housing provision, because we all know that apart from inward migration, which everyone's too embarrassed to talk about or acknowledge, there is also the question of high divorce rates, household formation, longevity, all a series of trends very revealable in the census, which tells you that whatever you thought about the number of homes you needed to provide, you were wrong. You need a lot more. Actually, I have to say the same thing happened in Singapore. Their projections for how many new homes they would need for the 21st century, they kind of hit them, I think, by year 15.
Was that a technological thing because more people are living alone or living separately?
Yeah, it was a combination of circumstances. It was kind of birth rate, longevity, because they've got a big health and well-being program. And the implication of that, of course, is not only that you have to start converting a percentage of your housing for use by people with disabilities, or just the results of age, which is costly. But of course, it means that they're not falling off their perch. So you go into either an upward or a downward spiral, depending on your point of view, of supply and demand. And I think that that is properly what the planning system should be there to proactively engage with. And we're sort of we're kind of ducking it a bit, aren't we?
Yeah. Well, from an architectural point of view, I'm interested in this idea of building reuse and longevity. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, a building should last 500 to 1,000 years, ideally, not 50 years. But I see a problem in that historical buildings tend to be very simple in their construction, and to have, for example, structural masonry or elements that are very permanent, which are and everything else is replaced over the years. And the permanent elements have the most architectural merit about them. Whereas in a contemporary building, the architectural bits that will last the longest, i.e. normally concrete frames, have the least architectural merit, and all the merit is sort of on the facade and all the little bits that break after 10 years. So how do we sort of, at an architectural level, make buildings that do last hundreds and hundreds of years, that can be reused? And do we have to sort of almost simplify buildings to some extent and stop them getting too complex?
Well, I think these are all good points, because the idea of Hebraken, I think the Dutch theorist and architect and teacher, in his 90s now, but what he promoted was the idea, in a sense, of the service box, that buildings should be quite non-specific in their uses. And out of that line of thinking came, the best phrase the RIBA ever coined, bar none, which was long life, loose fit, low energy. Now, those sorts of ideas are applicable, in fact, to any building type. But I think they're particularly important for housing, because the difference between, let's say, why is it that the Georgian house seems to be capable of being house, manufacturing base, shop, boutique hotel, etc., etc., etc. And there are analysable and definable things about a Georgian house which make all that possible. And I think we've rather ignored that in the pursuit of super functional, super cost efficient technologies which mitigate absolutely against long life. And that's just on the housing front. But then if you look at the embarrassing example of how is it that Victorian board schools have prolonged life, whereas the schools we were building in the 50s and 60s, kind of, you have to demolish them for various reasons. And of course there are reasons for why, cheap construction applied post World War II. But nevertheless, if you just take the architectural differences, you can see that long life, loose fit, relatively low energy, or low energy with some pretty simple retrofitting for all those Victorian schools and hospitals and lunatic asylums, is simply not the case if we look at the sort of buildings that we're doing today. And I think that is, again, it's got anything to do with aesthetics, actually, because even if you said, but they sort of realised though that they were building forever, and therefore they have ornament and decoration, etc., etc., etc. I could sort of see that as an argument, but I don't think that was the reason that they were doing it. They were doing it because that was what was culturally acceptable and a sort of cultural norm.
And most of them were built from pattern books by contractors, weren't they, rather than directly architecturally built. And
what we do is what volume house builders call gob-ons, which is the sort of mock Georgian bits and pieces that they slap illiterately over facades to try and give them a scintilla of interest. But of course, actually really good modernist architecture is fascinating all of its own. I mean, a lack of ornament can be as powerful as ornament, and but it has to be good, admittedly. But if you take that proposition, which is, well, how do we build for posterity? It has more to do with ease of servicing, ease of retrofit, and generosity, I think, of volume, in some ways more significant than space.
Or flexibility of volume as well. So rather than designing specifically for the function, the first function, you design with enough flexibility to accommodate possible future functions.
So we had a thing at CABE. We would look at hospital and say, well, is this an example of a really good contemporary hospital building for this year's fashions, or is it a good piece of architecture? And quite often it was not a good piece of architecture. And if you ask a simple question, if this building wasn't a hospital, what else could it be? You're in deep trouble. And I think that so this is this is not about aesthetics. This is actually an analysis of space and volume and servicing. And if you wanted to really promote long life, loose fit, low energy, I think what you might think about is that when significant buildings are coming in for planning permission, you'd ask for a double application. You'd ask for the first use, and then you'd ask for an alternative use where you've had to do some retrofitting, but show how you could use this for a completely different building type. And I'll give an example of where I think this, with some further thought, this could have happened. And in some cases, it may even be able to happen now. Let's take the shopping centre. Generally considered either it's there or it's not. If it's not there, you've got to knock it down. But actually, an analysis of a shopping centre tells you it would actually make quite a good hospital. Really? And if you look at the section through a shopping centre and a section through a hospital, you start to see similarities. You know, the big atrium. You know,
I'm just trying to imagine Blue Water Hospital now.
Exactly. But imagine their treatment rooms, and imagine that instead of wards, you've got individual rooms, which is the way we want to go anyway. I think that you could. I'd like to encourage some schools of architecture to have a crack at doing this because, and of course, locationally, generally, either they've got parking or they're in the middle of town.
Yeah.
Whichever way you look at it, they
actually
they look quite good as medical facilities. So I think it's so, and what would make it difficult usually is where the core goes. Now, thinking about the core for a second use is something that no one does. It's just like, well, let's put the cores where it seems to be most useful for this shopping centre. But if you were forced to think, okay, but from a retrofit point of view, the core's a bit of a disaster, and actually we could adjust the plan, we could adjust the core location, and then this building could be one of two or three different things without massive and undue expense. And I think the whole idea of demolition is nuts if you can possibly avoid it. All that embodied energy.
Well, is this where stage 7 starts to come in as a relevant thing? Like, my next question was going to be, if you're going to have that consideration of future use, at what level is that enforced? Is it a building regulations thing? Is it a planning thing? How do you incentivize or force the person doing the development on the first occasion to consider that?
Well, I think it's a good question, because you could do it. You could do it formally through the planning system, and just require people to make a double application.
Presumably then, though, they'd just pick whatever the easiest second option was.
That might not be so bad. I'm in the office that turns into a hotel. The interesting question is, if you would do it the other way around, would you require housing schemes to show how they could be used for something else? I think that's more problematical, because in truth, you know, housing estates, I mean, housing does tend to last forever. Unless it falls down.
Right in the centre, and you have Georgian houses becoming offices,
so it becomes more valuable. But in general, houses, I would say, are designed and built to last. You know, even build to let stuff doesn't look as though it'd be that easy to demolish. So I think that's very interesting territory, and that ought to be a modernist agenda, because it does relate to space and volume through time. And when we launched the Retrofit Awards at the Architects Journal, my pet acronym for retrofit is, it was the name of, which I don't know if they sell it anymore, but it was tinned dog food, and it was called PAL, and the TV version was PAL Meat for Dogs, and PAL stood for Prolongs Active Life. Now, prolonging active life, I think, is as good a definition of retrofit as you could get. And of course, prolonging it means bringing it up to current regulatory standards. So there's always a big energy and carbon story in any decent retrofit project. But the real point is, if you can't prolong the active life of a building, then it may have been okay as a building in its day, but I think it's bad architecture. And that inherent inflexibility and difficulties of that nice distinction between those, usually get it the wrong way round, adaptability and flexibility. So adaptability means that you can conduct the same activity in the building in different ways. The school that changes its classroom arrangements, etc., etc. And flexibility, the building that can turn into something else without undue difficulty. I might have flipped them. It doesn't really matter. It's just, it's two different notions. And good architecture is probably going to be generous enough in all sorts of respects to allow prolonged use, even though you may be doing things in a different way, but will also make it relatively easy to switch the use to something completely different.
I think you've got to have somebody or some organisation that's incentivized to do it, though. So having worked with Grosvenor, one of the interesting things about them is they do think in terms of 1, 2, 300 year cycles, because they're incented to do so. Whereas your day-to-day developer who's just flipping sites every 2 or 3 or 4 years isn't incentivized to do that. And even your local authority, you have your politician who's going to be elected for 1 term, maybe 2 terms. They're not going to be incentivized to do it because they're not going to be accountable for, even if a local authority retains ownership, they're not going to be accountable. So how do you incentivize somebody to be accountable for that long-term view?
Well, somebody always owns it. I mean, just because it gets traded doesn't mean the building hasn't got an owner. And, you know, in the case of apartments, then it's the leaseholders, possibly with a freeholder. And even if the freeholder changes, well, these ghastly ground rent crooks, there is always going to be an ownership position. And the position of those owners, unless they're intent on demolishing for other reasons, land value or whatever, but in general, they'll make money by not having to repair and replace and demolish. So I think there's potentially, at the very least, an inbuilt pressure to conserve and make things last, because apart from anything else, you know, it avoids the awful costs of, you know, structural repair, etc., etc. So assuming that building regulations don't change, actually, you know, once you've got concrete, steel frames and all the rest of it, this stuff lasts an awful long time. It's almost impossible to design for redundancy, actually, structure. Very, very difficult. Design me a power station that fails after 30 years. You can't. The use might stop after 30 years, but my God, the power station's still there.
Yeah.
Look at Battersea. You know, you can't, it's very, very difficult to design things that fail in the short term. This stuff lasts a long time.
Well, like I said at the beginning, it's the small things that fail quickly, isn't it? So it's the external skin, the facade, the interior finishings, all the little less resilient stuff. That's what has to be designed to be easily replaceable at regular intervals.
Well, this is the plug-in notion of the building, which was a sort of Hebrakan thing. Everything plugs in or plugs out, and you know, there are architects like Alfred Monaghan Morris have been obsessing about the universal building, as they call it. So, for example, their white collar factory office building in Shoreditch, at Old Street Roundabout, has been designed with very big floor to ceiling dimensions. It's deliberately kind of unfinished. It's tenants who fit the building out to their own specification, but they don't have to do very much unless they want to. You could go full Monty, but why would you? It's not that sort of a building. And the point is that the owners in 30 years' time, they could turn floors into school floors. But
Yeah.
conceptually they've done it.
Mm.
You could turn it into a hotel. You could do a whole load of stuff because it's forgiving and it's generous and it's well serviced. So that's the nearest kind of worked commercial example I can think of where those ideas about longevity and change of use have been deliberately worked into the design right from the outset.
Mm.
Now,
Does moving this on a bit in terms of the sort of technology side, I sort of come from a BIM heritage. I used to be a BIM manager. How can you incorporate that kind of thing in the building data using BIM to be able to see what's going to need replacing and what's going to be easily replaceable and what's designed to last 200 years, what's designed to last 5 years on an immediately accessible level from the very beginning?
I don't really see why not. I mean, Richard Rogers did all this with Lloyd's, 40 years ago. You know what's going to go first. Roughly, there's a sort of pecking order, isn't there? And if you want some of that stuff to last longer, well, just use more expensive materials and it will last longer. The real thing about that building was between the start of design and first occupation, the estimate of energy use had jumped 9 times, I think, because of technology changes to do with the electronic office. But in fact, what they designed was robust enough to be able to take the additional wiring, etc., etc., etc. I mean, in a sense, it proved the value of its architectural proposition before the client had moved in. I mean, it's a rather good example of an expensive building and an expensive architect, but they actually achieved something extraordinary without realizing how quickly the building would have to adapt to the technology revolution.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, isn't it? You don't know what it's going to end up being converted into, if
Exactly.
anything, and you've got to think about that, I suppose.
But you have got historical precedent. I mean, with the exception, I suppose, of computer suites, what spaces are different now to what they were 100 years ago?
Yeah. In terms of architectural education, how do you see what is it not doing right at the moment that it needs to change on, and how do you see it moving forward? Because I know you wrote a piece recently about the sort of schools taking responsibility for the qualification process. But how do you see architectural education progressing?
Well, let's hope they don't keep dishing out first like confetti, which is just ludicrous. Well, I think it's a very exciting time for schools of architecture. Firstly, because the RIBA, and I think dragging the registration board along with it, no doubt sucking air through their teeth, has come to terms with the notion that really people who've done, let's call it 7 years of full-time education, ought to be able to call themselves architects and should know enough to be able to take on a certain level of project in a competent professional manner. And I think that the fluid nature of how architecture is taught, term lengths, etc., 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 probably a good thing, because let's face it, everyone can do distance learning now, can't they? Everyone is a distance learner, and I think it's a huge kind of sort of fluid melting pot time for schools, where technology just opens up such extraordinary possibilities. The other thing I would hope is that I think it's a sort of apartheid culture, isn't it, where our architecture school, are they all about art or are they all about BIM? Well, the answer is they're not all about anything. They're all about everything.
Mm.
And actually, there shouldn't be this, I think, completely artificial distinction between what it is to practice and make things and what it is to think about things and design things. And I think there's been far too much emphasis on difference, and there should be far greater emphasis on kind of not similarities exactly, but just the fact that you should embrace the difference between theory and practice instead of never the twain shall meet. And how dare you suggest that anybody ought to be taught to draw, because drawing isn't academic subject. I still find it's completely bizarre. Well, of course architects should be able to bloody well draw. And the thing about this is that technology not only will assist them in that process, but will allow them to produce drawings which can be, as it were, oh, that's my Alberti version, or it's my Mies version. I mean, come on, can we just get with it? And the other thing is, of course, that the all bets are off as far as technology is concerned and where it's going to take us. Visualizations, simulacrums of cities and situations. I think it's incredibly exciting. But it doesn't take away from the fact that architects, as professionals, have moral as well as contractual obligations to clients and to users.
Yeah.
And they just need to know what they're doing.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I call this podcast Theory of Architecture is that I've been sort of struck, having worked in quite a range of practices over the years, how little conversation there is about why you're building something the way you are. Like, designs just seem to be sort of magicked up in 2 or 3 days from a few sketches that the directors do, and they think, oh, I'll do that because it looks a bit better. And there's no really deep thinking about why it is that you design something a certain way.
No, I think this is very important, because if schools err on the side of, as it were, architecture for architecture's sake, then I fear that too many practices are unreflecting or unreflective about the design process and why it is that they're proposing that thing for that site. Where's it come from? And I think you often find, with we observe this at CABE Design Review quite a lot, where architects will present a proposal and essentially they're just giving you a long list of constraints and showing how they've managed to meet the constraint. You say, okay, fine, you had 12 constraints, you've met all of them, but unfortunately, this is terrible.
Yeah.
Why don't you just design something why don't you design something good? What is good? Okay. Why don't you design something which is great, which you really think will be fantastic for this site, and then make that design effortlessly meet the constraints? Why are you starting with constraints? Why aren't you starting with a positive proposition? And you take, actually, the site isn't a constraint. The site's an opportunity.
Yeah.
The site's wonderful.
Well,
the neighbours are wonderful.
A lot of architects seem to have lost that sense of boldness about having that wider vision, rather than saying, oh, we mustn't conflict with this constraint and that constraint, and then using parametric tools to generate a building out of the constraints and then just adding a facade on it or whatever it is, rather than, like you say, having a sort of taking the opportunity to make something that they have a vision for, and then using skill and competence to make it not conflict with the constraint.
This is why the late, great Will Alsop said form has nothing to do with function. Now, he didn't mean that you should willfully design things that were incapable of being used, but what he was objecting to was the sort of the narrow functionalist notion that actually the only function of the building is to allow certain activities within it, and that's all that matters. Then you end up with tight-fit buildings like modern hospitals. And his point was, but supposing the wider function of the building, shall we say, is to delight everybody who looks at it. Now, is that functional or isn't it? Well, the functionists would probably say not. But actually, of course, it's part of the function of architecture.
Absolutely.
It's part of visual culture. And there aren't so many architects who take that sort of view, and if they do, then they tend to get buttonholed as kind of, victims of iconitis or whatever. But of course, an icon's a good thing if history judges it to be so. But bad architects say, "Oh, my clients asked me for an icon, so I'll just do something wacky," is of course useless, and that's actually a denial of architectural theory, and it has no integrity whatsoever. Rather like the client who's asked for an icon.
Yeah, well, like you say, in terms of the definition of what the function of a building is, I would say it does obviously include to consider the people outside of the building looking at it, and to consider its context and its wider urban landscape, and to act harmoniously with them, unless its specific function is to be an icon, like the Guggenheim or something like that. I'd say most buildings do have that responsibility, and that should be considered part of their function.
Yes, and in theory, of course, planning suggests that those are the considerations that should be taken into account, and that actually the dreaded red line of site ownership, rather than being a determinant of what's being done, should just be one of many elements that contribute to the creative process of making something extraordinary. I mean, I think this business about context and respect are things that have to be considered and argued out on almost every occasion. Supposing it's a bad context, and that actually what you need to do is to transform it. So you absolutely do not want to be like anything else around. And I think that is is this a place, if you look at which we still use at World Architecture Festival, actually, we give judges criteria. They're not tick boxes. They say, look, the spirit of our judging should be carried out under the CABE design review document, I think, of 2002. And in that, it sets out, it's called What Makes a Good Project. There's a section in it called What Makes a Good Project. And it actually defines the things that should be taken into account. Now, just because you took them into account doesn't mean you've successfully taken them into account. But on the other hand, if you haven't taken them into account, it's a failure. And one of the biggest failures is that red line idea, that you don't take proper account of your context. And I think whether you're doing exclamation marks or genuflecting is going to depend on circumstance. I think all one can say is that, pastiche, I think, can be great. I think pastiche has become a sort of, highly pejorative term, actually, quite wrongly. I like the thing in Miami Beach in the Art Deco district. If they're doing a new building down there, the motto to describe the spirit in which additions should be designed to the existing streetscape is similar but not the same. They do not want people to replicate stuff from the 30s and 40s. It's not going to work. Actually, it won't look the same even if you did exact copies, and you never can do exact copies for all sorts of reasons.
Well, I think for a lot of architects, though, even the idea of similar would be offensive as an idea. The idea of referencing to any significant degree or meaningful degree the current context is sort of as a pejorative idea. Well, this goes back to the idea of beauty, isn't it? Why is it that architects are so allergic to the idea of discussing what beauty means?
Well, I think because the word is too loaded, and actually, it's Gothic or classical, when you couldn't get a greater punch up, could you? So are we supposed to say that actually the Palace of Westminster should have been like Westminster Abbey, or Whitehall really was a total disaster being done in a classical manner? I think you find similarities. It depends what you're looking for. I mean, at a certain level, you know what? Buildings are the same. You take a Farrell building and a Grimshaw building, which, oh my God, they're so different. You know what? They're not that different. And I think that actually there's a huge level of similarity at a certain level of analysis. You know, you take the Gherkin, take the Lloyd's building, quite an interesting thing. Well, it depends what your precedents are, doesn't it, about what you're looking at? Because you could look at industrial buildings in the city, you could look at power stations, and you could look at its jukebox. It's sort of faintly, I don't know what it is. It's a sort of little nod to Brunelleschi. I've never understood why they did that sort of strange Vegas topping to it. It wasn't on the original drawings. But nevertheless, I think you can find a lot of similarities between buildings. And if you looked at, let's say, another Rogers building, the Lloyd's Register building, within spitting distance of Lloyd's of London, and you say, well, these are completely different buildings. But actually, you start analysing it, they're not that different. They look different. But, you know, that's like saying two human beings, we don't look the same. But actually,
pretty much the same.
Eyes, nose, etc., etc., etc. So I think there's a sort of, you know, the buildings that are really different are ones with a fundamental difference in use. So, for example, the 19th century railway station couldn't be a classical building, actually, because of what it was there to do. But it could still be. It's still got proportions. Still has its entry sequence and so on and so forth. So I think that, you know, and the other thing is that good buildings have it's a version of Tolstoy, isn't it? You know, all happy families are the same, all unhappy families are unhappy each in their individual way. Good buildings have got a lot in common, and it's nothing to do with what they look like. They have an integrity about them. They have a sort of what you see is what you get. There's a kind of inevitability about why things are the way they are, and they have good circulation, and they have their moments. And bad buildings are kind of, well, you know, they're all around us. Good ones are hard to find.
Yeah.
And, but, you know, does anyone really set out to know, oh, I'm going to design a bad building today?
Yeah. Well, I think it's taking it back to education. I think it's interesting to sort of think about how it's taught in terms of the differences between good and bad architecture, because there's I think far too much of a focus at the moment on concepts, and especially on socio-political agendas as well. Like, you go around a lot of the degree shows, and everyone has their own effectively political agenda or political project or socio-political intervention, and all of the merit seems to be focused on how good that is rather than on how good the actual architecture is. Sorry, throw her off if you want to.
No, well, there's a actually, I should add something to what the architecture schools. So what I do think is there isn't nearly enough architectural history taught, or history of construction. You know, architectural history in the end is sort of a history of everything, because the buildings actually embody within them the history of time and place and politics and money, inevitably, which is why it's so interesting. And I think it's sort of embarrassing if architects have a lesser knowledge of architectural history and indeed architectural styles than somebody from the amenity society that they're talking to at a party.
Yeah, well, this is one of the things that Tim Britton-Catlin was saying, is that they did a special, some kind of special set of lectures or talks about architectural history and historical elements and all these sorts of things.
Yeah.
And the feedback he got from the students was, why aren't we taught this all the time?
Quite.
Like, why don't we have the language? Why aren't you equipping us with the language to talk about these things? And he said that there may be a fear that if architectural students are taught about historical architecture, that they'll then start doing historical architecture rather than doing modernism or anything that isn't just a pastiche.
I suspect it's because there aren't enough really good teachers equipped to do all that stuff.
Mm.
I mean, you know, let's say if you take an architect like Eric Parry, super sophisticated, absolutely knows his history and theory inside out, but then he was taught by Dalibor Vesely. There aren't too many Dalibors around, or Joseph Rickards.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I completely agree. I mean, I think, history, and of course that includes theory. You can't have a history of architecture without understanding the history of theories of architecture. It's like it is literally the building block, isn't it? It's the foundations, and I don't think it gets, a guy taught for years at an institution where he had to teach the students about the Renaissance in like 2 45-minute lectures or something. That's preposterous. And I fear that's the dirty little secret. Actually, it's not that the stuff is being badly taught or taught as propaganda. It's that it isn't being taught at all, or it's not being taught nearly enough. And therefore the discussions about where the stars come from, why do they change, etc., 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 what are accidental, what are deliberate, what derive from technology, and so on and so forth, what derive from politics.
Yeah. Well, does the RIBA have a role to play in that? Does it have to set more rigorous requirements for what schools have to teach in order to get Part 1 and Part 2 accreditation?
It's pretty tough because formally it's the ARB's job, but in association with the RIBA. I think that the movement is towards more autonomy for schools themselves. That's the way things are moving. And I think it's up to the schools to be quite reflective about the outcome of, the 7 years or 5 years for sure, 4 or 5 years. It's almost, the history of architecture is almost a sort of foundation course subject, isn't it? Why, who has built what and why, and for whom and how. I used to give a talk to Bartlett students on a media course. It was an MSc course. And my point was that if you asked a question about any building project, in the way that you would talk about, that a journalist would talk about a news story, a competent news story says who, what, where, when, how, and why. If you ask those questions about any building and you have anything like a full answer, then you will have an extraordinary history.
Yeah.
And I think this isn't just, I don't think it's appreciated enough how much history of architecture is the connection to everything.
Yeah. Well, how do you get to the point where that's reintroduced? Like, if there aren't the teachers who are competent enough to teach it, how do you get from where we are now to a position where history of architecture is taught rigorously?
It's just reminded me that at CABE years ago we looked at, and I'm trying to remember what happened to this idea. I think we produced some sort of paper where we suggested the teaching of architecture. That's right. So this was just an idea. It wasn't implemented, but it was a proposition as to how architecture could be introduced into the curriculum in schools. And of course, the answer to that was via the art teacher. And the notion was that we proposed that a set of teaching aids should be produced, like models with visuals, so that the art teacher wouldn't, if they didn't have to be expert in architecture, they could just look it up before they gave the before they did the lesson.
Yeah.
And that actually what you would do is sort of, I think there was even a title for it. I think it was History of Architecture from the pyramids to the pyramid in the Louvre, or something like that. It was something quite contemporary at the time, and that notion was to actually explain why things looked like they did, and why they were built, and who they were for, etc., etc., etc. And it's an amazing story, of which classicism is a significant part.
Yeah,
but it's not the only part.
yeah,
And I think that is. I would just take it as read that I think the idea of a dominant, especially looking across the world, would be odd, but people have got to understand why things were done. And I don't know. I don't know. Do they teach proportion?
yeah.
Don't know.
Well, I think
I assume so. You should know.
Well, as much as we sort of make fun of Prince Charles and the classicists, I think we forget that there is actually a lot of valuable information within the learning of traditional architecture.
No, completely. I think it's kind of intellectually dishonest to try to ignore classicism. I mean, it's ludicrous. It's completely unhistorical and absurd, and everyone should know their Serlio, shouldn't they? It's the question is that you really don't have to take sides on this, and I think the head banging just bores me, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
Because the truth is that most of the early modernists had all been brought up in a classical tradition, and in the same way that the Impressionists had all been brought up as classical artists, and for whatever reason, they had to find their own language and ways of expression because the old ways just weren't doing it for them.
Mm.
And I think rather than say, well, what a disaster that was, or how terrible it was, is to understand why that was. A lot of the sort of binary thing that's happened, are you a classicist or aren't you? It's a sort of meaningless question. And I think that what I think happens is when you get really intelligent people who are usually not on either side of this so-called debate, they're just really intelligent people, they can have a conversation. But there's no point in trying to say to somebody like Eric Parry, well, it's really so unfortunate that you're doing these tall office buildings, shock horror. And although Leon Creel is a very witty polemicist, I think sort of pretending that the international office market doesn't exist, it was kind of futile. And of course Leon wasn't interested in designing office buildings, it wasn't what he did. But I think that it doesn't mean that other people can't quite legitimately do exactly that. And they're not going to be dressing them up in any particular style, actually. They'll derive from a whole series of issues. And that's kind of what makes the world go round. But one of the things that they would derive from is ideas about proportion. After all, the city of corporation planners, they want a base, middle and top as much as Alberti did. And they're in a position to insist on it.
Yeah. All right, well, to bring this back to a final question then, back onto the Building Beautiful Commission, what can the architectural profession, the architectural media and the government and all the people involved do to work together and have a conversation that is productive and not tainted by judgments and history to progress everything forward in a productive way?
It's a good question. I think it might be that there's a reminder about why classicism has been important to architecture in Europe and in America in particular. I think one of the most interesting stories is the transatlantic back and forth of architectural ideas, from Washington onwards. So classicism is exported to the land of wigwams by, the early Europeans. And then, and Ruskin is published in sort of, as far as I can tell, samizdat editions in America at some point. So the ideas are very important. Frank Lloyd Wright reads Ruskin, and etc. And then at a certain point, American ideas around industrialization start having an effect on Europe. The European modernists eventually go to America and do their thing. The Americans export the commercial cousin of that sort of, let's say, Bauhaus architecture in the form of the glazed skyscraper. They export that to Europe and everywhere, really. But the latest thing is that European architects working in quite individual styles and actually not as part of any sort of movement sort of grab hold of the imagination in New York, where all the sort of big name star architects are all doing stuff alongside the Americans, but in unprecedented numbers. I mean, you couldn't get into America to do buildings. The only Brit architect who ever did anything in America until relatively recent was Alfred Bossum, who did commercial architecture in Houston before he came home, and he was the man who became a cabinet minister, didn't he? And Churchill said about him, Bossum, neither one thing nor the other. But then, now Foster and Rogers and Nouvel and Hadid and you name it, and they're all over in America. And I think that transatlantic flow is very, very interesting, and a lot of it derives from these cultural exchanges, which initially all stem from classicism. I think that's a really interesting story, rather undertold. And I think that the best way, really, to approach these questions of cultural difference is through history. And the more you find out, the more you realise that, yes, of course there are differences, but there are an awful lot of similarities. That in the end, I think good architects and good architecture have much more in common with each other, irrespective of style, than one might at first imagine.
Well, on that distinctly international note, where can everyone find out about the World Architecture Festival?
www.worldarchitecturefestival.com. Very active website.
Where is it this year?
All the details. We're in Amsterdam, first week in December.
First week of December, brilliant. Well, that's sufficiently close that I may be able to make it this year.
Very good.
Which will be fantastic. And Paul Finch, thank you very much.
Hope to see you there.
Cheers. Bye.